Well, my name's Doug Johns, and I'm in Creston, British Columbia, in Western Canada, in the mountains, and we have a beautiful sunny day today. And my pleasure to be able to do an interview with Corey Burba from Romania. The purpose of these interviews is to inspire you, to encourage you, to show you some of the good things that are happening around the world. And I'm going to bring Corey into the studio right now. Corey, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Hey, this is great. This is great. Corey, I wanted to remind you of the very first time we met. And that was and I have our photo album from our Romania trip are you ready? In 2012.
Oh my goodness.
In 2012, and this whole Romania trip in 2012 was what we called the Facebook tour of Romania. Every contact in that trip of a few weeks was with people that we had met over Facebook. And some people were thinking, oh, you're crazy. You don't really know if the people that you meet on Facebook are really who they say they are. You have to show a little bit of caution and discretion. But we prayed that the people would be good people and people we could identify with and trust. And we went all over the country in 2012. And you were one of the first contacts. And I'm going to show you, Corey, the page from our visit with you. Now, can you see this?
Yes.
Just amazing. So you have two children, and your son had just been born. He was so little. We're going to come back to family in a moment, but tell us at least about your immediate family.
Well, I live here in Oradea, Romania, western side of Romania, with my wife, Diana. She was born here, is a native Romanian. And we have two children. Both of them were born here while we were over here in Romania. Evelyn, who's 10 years old, and Christopher, who you just mentioned, who is 8 years old.
Wow. Wow. Evelyn is quite the young lady. And Christopher is quite the young man, full of energy.
Oh, yes.
I think they both are, but Christopher seems to be, he probably goes 100 miles an hour.
He does.
Just amazing, just amazing. How does a young man from Nashville, which is your home, how does a guy from Nashville end up in Romania?
Well, that is a good question. I would start off by saying that my mother was involved with adoptions from Romania for about 20 years. She worked for an adoption agency in Nashville. And she made numerous, I want to say probably about a dozen trips over her career working with that adoption agency to Romania. So she had a lot of experience coming here and helping families who were adopting from Romania. Of course, as probably most people know, or some people know, the adoptions got shut down in the year 2000, 2001. International adoptions from Romania were closed by the government. So what that adoption agency decided to do was to try and match older orphans with people in the United States and Canada who were interested in adopting older orphans. And so to facilitate that, they brought them over to the U.S. for a summer camp. And that's where I was really first introduced to Romanian orphans, was at that summer camp, which was a very impactful experience, obviously, for me.
Wow. Wow. Well, we remember, those of us who are old, remember 1989 and remember December of 1989 and the fall of Ceausescu. And in the immediate aftermath of that, the world heard about the dire conditions of so many Romanian orphans. So it was on the news, and then, as you mentioned, within a couple of years, that was all shut down in terms of the world being
Yes.
able to jump in and adopt, and that's a whole nother discussion for
Yes.
as to whether it's good or not to be adopting internationally. Um, but take us now, 30 years later, take us to the situation right now in Romania. And uh, you would think in today's society that orphans would be well looked after, and it wouldn't be such a big deal once they once they turn 18 and become young adults. So uh, I guess, if you saw the pictures from Ceausescu's regime and the care of orphans, you understand why there was a need to step in, right?
Yes.
Why now? Why is there still a need to do the kind of work that you're doing?
Well, I do have to say that the living conditions, the conditions that the kids grow up in the orphanages are quite different than, a lot of the stuff that was seen when communism fell in 1989, 1991, when they did all those hidden documentaries and things like that. Very, very disturbing stuff. Nevertheless, even today, the way that the children are treated in the orphanage is obviously not it's not conducive to preparing them for a life once they leave it. So they become, in a way, institutionalized in the sense that they learn how to get along in the orphanage amongst other kids like themselves, but when they leave the orphanage, they are totally unprepared for a normal life. So they are given at the orphanage food and clothing and medical care, and they go to school and things like that, that back during communist times maybe were neglected. But a lot of the same abuse goes on, just the neglect, even if the orphanage is run by good people and they have a good heart and they want to help the kids. There's just so many of them. One person trying to deal with 20 unruly orphan kids is quite difficult, I can tell you. Do that day after day, and things can add up. And all of this leads to the point where finally, around 18 years old, the young person has to leave. And unfortunately, at this point, there is very, very little help for them. It's a very difficult time, I think, in anybody's life. I remember when I was growing up, my late teen years, I get in all kinds of trouble. That transition from being a teenager in high school to becoming a responsible adult, I think is hard for most people who come from normal families. These poor kids, and I call them kids, they might be 18, 19, 20 years old when they're released, but they are so far behind in so many ways that we usually just kind of knock off 10 years. If the person's 22, he almost acts like a 12-year-old.
Okay.
Thinks like a 12-year-old. Developmentally, his educational level is probably around that, if that. So that's the real difficulty. And in some ways now, it's a little bit more similar with our foster system that we have in the U.S. and in other places. And they have pushed the foster system here in Romania as well, in the sense that if you look at the statistics, even in the U.S. and other developed countries, kids coming out of the foster system and then trying to make their way in society, whether it be in Canada or the U.S. or wherever, Romania, it's incredibly difficult for them. So these kids have it bad in several ways, in that they're not coming out of the foster system, they're coming from an orphanage life. The second aspect that I would mention as to why it's so difficult, a good portion, and it depends on where you're at in the country of Romania. It's actually a quite varied country, but the majority of the kids who grow up in the orphanage system are of Roma ethnicity. Some people know them better as gypsies, although that's become not such a nice word to call them anymore. So most people call them Roma nowadays. And in this way too, things have changed quite a bit in Romania. They've been more accepted. There's been more awareness, but still, those types of racist attitudes that have been around, since the world began, probably don't just disappear in 30 years. And the problem with them is that they're not accepted by the Roma community because they grew up in the orphanage.
Okay.
But they're not accepted by regular society either, because you could tell them right away that they're of Roma ethnicity. And even with the way they act and talk and dress, you can tell that it's a person who grew up in the orphanage. People who grow up in Roma communities act and talk and dress differently than Roma kids who grow up in an orphanage. So there's this whole set of preconceived ideas, stereotypes, if you will, that automatically flash in somebody's mind when they just see the person. Okay. Then when you get to talking to them, you can see their education is not where it should be. A lot of times when they come out of the orphanage, the way they speak is very rough and coarse. They don't have a lot of respect for themselves or for other people. They've not really been taught how to work in a job where you would actually have to listen to a boss. And, working conditions in Romania can be a bit rough for normal people. We've had situations where we found a young person a job only to have the person lose the job in a day or two because they would just refuse to do whatever the boss told them to do.
Right.
So basic things like that. And all of these things are just against them from the time they leave that orphanage, and it's very difficult to overcome.
So at some point, you must have observed that, and with your heart for Romania, and now a heart for orphans, being these kind of things going on in your heart, in your mind, did you get the idea of Beauty from Ashes Center? How did that come to you? Was it an idea? Was it a calling? I'm sure it's a calling. Was it a vision? Who did you talk to? How did that come about?
Well, it came about after quite a few years of living and working here. I'm trying to think now. We're in 20. I would say I was over here for 6, 7, 8 years before we ever started the Beauty from Ashes Center. And we tried all kinds of different things. We would go into the orphanage. We would do different activities with the kids. After a year or two of that, we started doing Bible studies with them where they would come out of the orphanage. We figured that was better for them to get out of the orphanage. Then after another year or two of that, so about 4 years in, we realized that, okay, they're leaving the orphanages and they don't have anywhere to go. So we helped them find an apartment. So 3 or 4 of them would pool their resources, find an apartment. But, you would have situations where they would leave the apartment and just leave the door wide open. Or, they nearly burned the place down. Or, there's a whole slew of things. I could go on and on with the war stories of stuff that we went through then. And it occurred to me at that point that it wasn't enough just to take care of their physical needs. That, yes, they had a place to live. They weren't sleeping on the streets, which we've dealt with quite a few orphans who have done that as well. They weren't being sold and used in human trafficking, which we've had girls who have been involved in that. We've had girls who were kept prisoner here in our city for over a year in apartments and forced to prostitute themselves.
Wow.
So all of those things, were being taken care of. They had food to eat, and because they were living in the apartment, they had to pay rent. So they were learning at least that they had to go to a job and get their salary and pay their rent, go to the job, get their salary, pay their rent, this life cycle that we're all in. So there were good things about it, but it wasn't enough. I didn't feel like it was enough to get them to the point where they could really thrive. They might survive, and not all of them did.
Yeah.
But it wasn't enough for them to thrive. And that's when it kind of hit us that, what if we actually lived with the girls and tried in a certain period of time to erase some of the bad stuff that they learned before in the orphanage and teach them a lot of these things that they did not know, or these skills that they did not have, being with them, pretty much 24 hours a day. And that's kind of how that came about. And that was about 12 years ago.
Okay. Okay. And you have really established this ministry as stable as you can be in a nonprofit setting, and depending on donations and funds, and
Right.
but you have a wonderful setup with really a house that has was that house modified for this, or did it come already with lots of room? And how many are living under one roof with your family? And tell us a little bit about what it's like to live there. What do your days or your weeks look like? I mean, I'm going to direct people to the Facebook page soon here on the interview, and they'll see some pictures. But just tell us a little bit about what it's like to be living there as one great big family, and some of the things you're doing with the girls.
We were really blessed. The house, I wish I could kind of take you around maybe another time.
Yeah.
It's very large even by American standards, but by European, Romanian standards, it's quite big. It is 3 levels plus an attic. So the girls live on the bottom level. They have their own bathroom, washing machine, everything is down there, and we can semi-comfortably house 6 girls at one time. So when we did decide to do this, we decided we were really going to invest in a relatively smaller number. We're not having a very large place with 20 kids or anything like that. 6 was kind of the number that we came at. It was enough for the space that we have. That was enough. That was about all the girls that we could handle at one time. In the middle level is where the kitchen is. So the girls do an awful lot of work. I would call it home ec or house management type stuff.
Yeah.
And that would include money, budgeting money, shopping, cooking, cleaning, repairing stuff, taking care of the yard. And as we developed, when we moved here, the people had already planted a small orchard. And we have really developed that into 2 big greenhouses that produce an awful lot of fruits and vegetables. We raise animals of different kinds, and it's really gotten to be almost like a small farm. I think probably a lot of people would consider it a small farm. It's not on a grand scale, so I kind of minimize it, but it takes a lot of work. So the girls are involved in all that.
Okay.
During this time, we've been pretty much locked down here at the Beauty from Ashes Center. We've dug up, planted, sowed, put up a new greenhouse, and done all kinds of work. So we try to, and we're not totally there, but try for a lot of the food that we eat to produce it ourselves.
Okay.
And the girls are involved in that as well. So that takes up an awful lot of time. They also work full-time jobs. Now, when they first move here, a lot of times they're not capable of doing that, as I mentioned before. But over time, they are. And one of the things, and this would have been maybe 10 years ago. I don't think we were here, but about a year or 2 before we started to do what they call business as mission, where the idea would be to self-finance some of the ministry by providing jobs for the girls who were coming out of the orphanage. And it was very difficult to teach them all this stuff, but it was great for them because we started a small business making handmade crafts. And we would teach the girls how to do this, and we would pay them a salary. And at the beginning, sometimes with some of the girls, we had to just start with like 2 hours a day. It was enough if we could get her to wake up at a certain time, get dressed, and come upstairs to work. And it was really basic stuff, like pasting something over and over again, almost like an assembly line thing. But it was really amazing to see. But after a month of that, they were ready for 4 hours of work. After a month of that, they were ready for 6, and then it was 8, and then there would be extra orders, and all of a sudden, some days they were working 12 hours even when we needed to, and they just flourished. They felt better about themselves because not only were they learning a skill and learning how to do something that we really needed them to do, they were needed, but they were also making, money. So we would pay them their salary, and they would be so happy to get their salary, and they would pay, their bills, or they would have money to go and buy something at the store. Or a lot of them actually did better than that. They saved up their money and got laptops and iPhones and stuff like that you wouldn't think that they could. Clothes that they wanted and different things like that. You mentioned about my family. I do like to travel, as I know you do as well. But that costs money, and so a lot of times the girls will save up money to go on a vacation with us.
Uh,
Sometimes it's shorter trips around here, but last year one of the girls came with us to Bulgaria and Serbia. There have been other times where they've gone to. We did one trip to Scandinavia and they came. So sometimes the girls will come with us when we fly back to the U.S. So all of those things keep us awfully busy here. We also homeschool our kids, so a good chunk of the day, a couple hours at least, is spent doing that. And then there's work outside to be done, and then there's a lot of paperwork to be done, and it just before you know it, it's 10 o'clock at night.
yeah,
You're wore out.
I just can't imagine how you don't get exhausted and burnt out. And I know that you have a few things that you like to do that take you, in all of our years in Christian camping, we knew that our time off, we had to remove ourselves from the camp situation, or else we were just still on duty.
Right.
And I know that you like to get away, and you like to hike, and you like to climb mountains. But what do you do in terms of your family? The four of you, how do you maintain your family identity in the midst of living 24/7 in a bigger family? What are there things you do intentionally? Because you probably eat most of your meals communally. So it's a big family meal table, and you cook together. So what do you do to give your son and daughter and wife a sense of our identity isn't just in this big group, if that makes any sense?
It's been very challenging. I can't lie. There's no easy answers to it, and yes, we have tried to do certain things intentionally to keep somewhat of a space between. For example, I mentioned where the bottom level where the girls live, the middle area is where we cook and have the Beauty from Ashes boutique where they do the handmade crafts. But the upper level is where I live with my family. We try. The rule is they're not allowed to come up here. And sometimes they do for different things when there's stuff going on. But that's one thing where we try and kind of keep a barrier. But it is very challenging, and it's become even more challenging as our kids have gotten older, because they see the girls as their sisters.
Yeah.
But some of the girls don't stay. They'll stay for a while and then they'll leave. So it's very hard for them to understand. And a new girl will come in, and they have to get to know her, and sometimes that doesn't go so well. Sometimes it goes great. One of the girls who you mentioned at the beginning, who is on the chat, we've known her for 20 years. Deanna's known her even longer.
Cool.
She was there when both of our children were born, and I don't think that the kids would. It would be like losing a sister if something happened to her. She's one of the family. So in some ways we are able to keep separated, but in other ways we're not. So it's definitely a challenge.
Yeah. And a blessing. And a blessing.
Yes. Right.
How many kids just grow up and don't know that there's a bigger world, and don't see the dynamics of relationships, and don't see the challenges that brings. So I think you can view that as both a challenge and a blessing.
Yeah, I agree, and I've thought about this, of course, over the years, and yeah, there are some negative things, but on the whole, I think it's been a very positive experience for our kids, and I think that later on, as they turn into adults and later on in their lives, it will have an incredible impact on them later on.
Sure, sure. Their past experience will be so much broader than most kids, and
Yeah.
I think that that they'll thank you for that when they become adults. And how long do the girls usually live with you in a successful situation? How long would they be with you?
In a successful, this is the very most successful. Okay, this is the highest, and this has only probably happened with a handful of girls over the years, maybe half a dozen or so. What happens is they become very attached to us, and as I mentioned before, they're really one of the family. They
Yeah.
consider themselves, and we consider them to be one of the family. And what happens then is we don't have a time limit. So that when the girl comes into the house here and comes into our program, we don't say, okay, you have 2 years and you have to leave. Instead, it's much more open ended. The girls know that at some point they will leave, but it's different. It's almost like growing up in a very large family, and you see your sisters and brothers going off to college, and then they get married and they move to Phoenix or whatever, and your life changes and their lives change, and that's kind of how it is. When we feel like they're ready, and they kind of feel like they're ready too, it's almost like just a gentle moving on, and it's usually somewhere fairly close by. They're not moving to Phoenix, obviously. They're pretty close by, and they come over all the time. So even though there's 6 girls who live here permanently or on a regular basis,
Yeah.
girls who have lived here and have moved on, they're over here all the time. So the house is always full.
Yeah.
And that has worked well over the years, because by that time they're like an older child who's maybe gone off to college, even though sometimes they're in their mid-20s by then, or even later. It depends on when they come. So that was the long way of answering your question. A successful situation takes usually several years. I would say 4 or 5 even before they're really to that point where they're very comfortable moving on. And we have had a few girls that it's almost been like the mama bird having to knock the baby bird out of the nest a little bit, but not usually. That's usually not the way it goes. By the time they get to that point, they're almost like in their teenage years. Remember, you can take 10 years off of their of what they actually are. So when they're around 28, they're more like an 18-year-old, and they're kind of getting to that point where they want to live their own lives anyway. They know enough to do okay in society and hold down a job and all that stuff that we've taught them over the years, but they want their independence, which we can totally understand. Yes, I mean, and we give it to them because that's what they need to move on to the next stage. So,
okay, just a couple more questions that are on my mind. I'm thinking, is there a blueprint for this? I mean, can this ministry be duplicated? Can you franchise this whole thing out? Because it seems to be a success story. At least as we get to know you and hear the stories. Are there other places doing something similar, whether it's in Romania or other maybe Eastern Bloc countries?
This area where the young people transition either from foster care or from orphanages into the real world is well known to be a very difficult area to work in. So a lot of people like to focus on working with kids when they're still in the orphanages, or maybe even working with families before they abandon their children to the orphanages, which we didn't really go into. Very rare over here where a child winds up in an orphanage and both parents are dead. So there's a lot of different scenarios there. But the short answer is no, there's not a lot of people doing exactly what we do, although there are other people who do similar things with good results. Even here in our city of Oradea, we know one group that has a very large impact here in our area. They're called the Camino Felix, and they have hundreds. They've worked with probably thousands of kids over the years in small family homes of about 10 children. So that's another way that people help, and that works very well. But again, when the young person is not really a child anymore, transitions from that home to real life, it's very difficult for them as well. So it is just a very difficult area to work in. I was drawn to it from the very beginning because I saw I guess I felt, I also, like I mentioned, that I also had a rough time in my late teens, early 20s. So I could kind of feel for them in that way. I grew up without a father, so that was another aspect of it. On top of that, just the idea that they were being released into society with basically no help at all. It was almost like they would give them $20 and say, good luck, if they even did that. And then the other factor was the girls especially, which is why we minister mainly to girls, was that most of them we were seeing were winding up in prostitution, human trafficking, or some sort of a sexually compromised situation like that. And there was really no other option for them. And, I just couldn't, I could understand the logic of, and I understand people who do that and work with different sectors or different ways of trying to minister to orphans. But I just felt from the beginning that was where God was pulling me to specifically work with the kids as they tried to transition from the orphanage to living in society.
Okay, and how about this question, which needs to be asked? And I know that people who watch this video going forward and may be interested in helping you. How are you financed? And do you get any government money? Although in Romania it wouldn't be very much if you did. But do you get any help from the Romanian government, or do you rely mostly on donations? And is that I've got an address here that I'll put up, so we can do that now. We do rely mostly on donations. We do. Okay. I had mentioned trying to self-finance with the small business, and that never really panned out. I guess we probably tried to bite off a little bit more than we could chew. It's great, and it is still going, and it provides salaries for the girls who continue to work here. But it never got to the point where we kind of wanted it to, where we would be funding part of the ministry or a majority of the ministry or something like that. That never quite materialized, or it has not yet. So yes, we do depend mainly on donations. Very little help from the government, either back in the U.S. where we're based, or here in Romania. It's mainly by donations. Yes. And so when you come back to the U.S. to visit your family, you also have to do a little bit of work too, and do what missionaries call deputation, and meet some people, keep them up to date, and hopefully giving them opportunities to contribute.
Yes, we definitely do a lot of that.
Yeah. Okay, well, I want to take us to, as we close here, I just want to take us to your Facebook page, if we can, just for a minute, and show that you guys have a Facebook page. Can you see that? A picture of your new puppy?
Yes.
Yeah. What's the name of the new dog?
Her name is Jessie, and she, right before I got on, she was attacking my son that you mentioned and knocking him down, and I think she tore up his pants playing with him.
Oh dear. And And on the right-hand side of this picture, can we see the old greenhouse after a storm?
Yeah, that was quite a storm, and that greenhouse, I believe it stood up for 7 years. It was there, and
Wow.
then that storm just tore it down. But we've got a better one now.
Yeah, I've seen the pictures. Amazing. You guys did such great work. Let's play this video if we can. And as we close off our time together, this is a great video. Wow, that's quite powerful, isn't it? I'm sure that every time you see that, and you probably know every line of the 2-minute video, but I'm sure that Corey, your heart is stirred every time you, because that's the story uh, that is happening and being repeated in girl after girl. And I know that there are times when that isn't the ideal ending, but um, that doesn't mean you stop. You keep going. So
Correct.
thank you for sharing your story and your ministry with us. And as I mentioned to you before we went on air, um, this video will be up on YouTube and Facebook, and there'll be a lot of other people who will hear about beauty from ashes. And you know, I went to that scripture about an hour ago, uh, and I looked up the passage in Isaiah, and it's just such a passage of instilling hope. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me to look after captives and to exchange beauty for ashes. Just a great passage. And you know, it's Old Testament image. It's a New Testament image too, in the way that Jesus lived his life and what he did in changing people's lives and giving them hope. And by the time James writes, we have this, the letter of James to James, James chapter 1, where pure religion, the essence of spirituality in Jesus especially is to show care to widows and orphans. People say that Christianity isn't practical. It's very practical. Jesus was very practical. I mean, you and I know how much of a theologian or amateur theologian you are, and I am, and we'd love to debate different aspects of theology, but in the end, it's what Christ does through us, and living out Jesus before people and with people. And that's what you're doing, you and your family. And we really appreciate that. And we pray God's blessing on you and your family. And we'll have you back. We'll have you back to talk more about this. And the other thing that really is a great story of inspiration and courage and going for your goals and whole leadership I mean, we can make you into a great motivational speaker. Your story, if you were to go to Corey's personal Facebook profile, right now on his picture is you standing on the top of a mountain. What mountain was that? Do you even know what mountain you were on when you took that picture?
I believe that is a mountain called Pietrosul. It's near, it's in the north of Romania.
Okay. But this is a real passion of yours to scale the heights. And I know that your family is involved in the lower ones. And we'll talk more about that sometime. Just your desire to hike and to climb the highest peaks of every country in Europe.
That's correct.
And there's been some great success stories and a couple of I got to go at it again.
Yes.
And we'll hear those stories sometime. Okay. So thank you very much for spending time with me this morning with our group. And we look forward to meeting you again in Romania. Oh, remember, on a subsequent trip to Romania, this is a hilarious story, and we'll close with this. We had landed in Bucharest, and somehow into the evening, we just got on Facebook, as we usually do, to check things out, right? And you were on, and I think you asked the question, where are you now? Are you in Romania? And I said, yes. And I said, I'm in Bucharest. And you said, oh, I'm in Bucharest tonight too. And I'm thinking, well, it's probably about 8 o'clock in the evening, and the chances of us finding each other and meeting up. And so I didn't pursue it. We just chatted, and that was it. The next morning, I'm going to the hotel desk to check out, and I see you. And we could have been across the hall from each other, and we could have had a meeting. And you were taking a train to Brasov, and we were driving to Brasov, and but just strange we were that close and didn't connect in person. Anyways, take care, and I hope that when all this COVID stuff is over, we'll get a chance to come back to Romania.
Well, that would be great. And thanks for having me.
Okay, good. God bless you. Take care.
Okay, bye. Thank you. Same to you. Bye-bye.
Okay, everyone. Thank you for spending 45, almost 50 minutes with me. Great interview with Corey from Romania. and encourage your people to check out this video, which will be up on my YouTube channel. And until next time, I want to say thanks and God bless you.